Hey there, it's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be talking about a question that I so often get, which is about bus processing in mixing. Like, should you do stuff to your stereo bus, your mix bus, your master bus, your tube bus, whatever you want to call it? Is it okay to compress your mix bus, to EQ your mix bus, to limit your mix bus, or should you use that stuff sparingly and save it for mastering? And the answer to this question really is, I'm going to give you different advice depending what your goals are or kind of how far along in the process you are. I'll tell you my ideal as a mastering engineer. And my ideal is that you submit something that sounds amazing. And I don't care what it took you to get it to sound amazing. And the more closely your mix sounds to the finished record, like your vision for how the finished record should sound, the better. And if that requires that you use compression, limiting, EQ, stereo enhancers, and I don't know what, a flanger on the mix bus, like I don't care. Do whatever it takes to make your thing sound great. And I will tell you that a lot of the best and most capable mixing engineers out there do bus processing. Like their bus processing is part of their mix. There's no question about it. There may be some exceptions to this, but I think you find that again and again, that a lot of really successful mix engineers allow their bus processing to do not all the heavy lifting, but have a significant impact on the final tone and feel and shape of the record. And their bus processing, to a degree, is going to smooth out some of the volume relationships. And this may not just be one bus. Famously, Michael Brower, I've interviewed numerous times, has a multi-bus approach where there's at least 4 different buses that each compress things separately, and then they go into a master group. A lot of people who are kind of native in the box mixers, who came up in a digital way, will have multiple subgroups. So they might have, a drum group and a bass group and a background vocals group and a guitars group and a keys group, and they may be doing some significant tonal shaping on those groups. So the long story short about should you compress, limit, EQ your mix bus is, if it's working for you and getting great results, yes. But what about leaving headroom for the mastering engineer? That's a question I get a lot. And as a mastering engineer, I'm going to answer it as soon as I give a big shout out to this week's sponsors, which includes you. How do you sponsor? By smashing the like button. If you are on the YouTube version of this podcast, if you're on audio only version, like you get an Apple podcast, give us a 5-star rating and review. If you don't mind taking just a second right now, 5-star rating, even just a line. Justin's really great. He's awesome. SonicScoop podcast is the best. Put it in. Love it. Also, comment down below if you have your own thoughts about this. All right, now let's get right into what about leaving some headroom for the mastering engineer. My answer to that is maybe yes, maybe no. Here is the one critical piece of advice that I would give, and this could be your one key takeaway. If your mix bus compressor, your limiter, your EQ is something that you mixed through, you put it on somewhat early in the process, maybe near the beginning, maybe in the middle, maybe 2/3 of the way through, and you spend a lot of time mixing through it, 3/4 of the way through, and you spend a lot of time mixing through it, then keep it on. It's part of your mix. You made mix decisions through it. Don't take it off. Your mix is going to change when you take it off. However, if you completed your mix and at the very, very end, the last thing you did was throw on a compressor just to see what you could make it sound like with the compressor, and then throw on a limiter just for loudness, and then you can kind of compare it to some of your reference mixes, and you're like, oh, my mix is too dark, it needs to be less muddy, and then you brighten it up with an EQ. Yeah, take all that stuff off. Don't send that to a mastering engineer. That's not part of your mix. That's your attempt at mastering. Right? It's a separate process. Mixing is focused on the relationships between elements, what you can do with a multi-track, getting the volume relationships right, getting the overall arc of the song right, getting the tonal balance of each element compared to another right. And then there's this second task of mastering, that final QC and that final audio sweetening that's done after we can't do any more of that. And we kind of listen to the whole thing as a finished product and say, what can we massage just listening to the final stereo master, and what needs to be double checked in a great environment where we can really hear all of the details, and hopefully in a really well-tuned room like this one or another mastering engineer's room. So that's the long story short. If you're mixing through compressors and limiters, and that's something that you're doing, leave them on for the mastering engineer. If you're throwing them on at the last minute for overall reference, take them off. And that's what you should send to the mastering engineer. Now, should you start mixing through mixed bus compressors? I would say that once you can hear the sound of compression and you feel like I have some idea of what compression sounds like and what it does to a mixed bus, then yeah, start playing around with it. As soon as you feel like you could articulate the difference in sound between a really slow attack and a really fast attack, then yeah, start messing with one on your mix bus if you want to. As soon as you say to yourself, I can kind of hear the difference between a really fast release time as opposed to a really long release time, yeah, you can start messing with one. If you can't hear those things yet, however, I've got some great videos on that, on understanding your compression better. If you search Justin Colletti compression, I'm sure you'll find a whole bunch of them, some with audio examples, and some of them which are just me talking at a microphone like the podcast is. So this is probably going to end up being a fairly short episode because there's not too much more to say on this. But I do want to throw out there loudness for the mastering engineer. How much should you compress or limit things? And again, the answer here is kind of the same as it was before. Do whatever it takes to make a great sounding mix at the mix stage. I don't care what you have to do. I don't care how much limiting you apply if it gets you closer to the desired end result. I would say, though, with compression and limiting, is don't overshoot, right? You err on the side of slightly less, and then a mastering engineer could always add more at the end if needed. So I would say chase the sounds you want, but err slightly on the side of not pushing it too far. Right? So a great way to do this is to push it too far, push your compressors and limiters too far until you say, that's bad. That's too much. I can hear this point where it's not going to be good anymore compared to the records I really love the sound of. And then back off, substantially from there and leave a little bit of extra room and err on the side of not pushing it too hard. Do I have LUFS levels that you should shoot for? No, not necessarily, because it is so relative to the kind of music that you love the sound of. And some records sound a certain way in part because they are mixed or mastered up to 6 LUFS or something, -6 LUFS. And some of them have the sound that they have because they're mastered down at -14 or whatever. Those numbers might not mean anything to you. But a good thing to do is to do whatever it takes to get you where you want, erring on the side of doing slightly less mix bus EQ than you think you could get away with, slightly less compression and limiting on the mix bus than you think you could get away with. But also don't be afraid to be bold. Is this a nebulous answer? In a way, yeah. I mean, it kind of is. There's no exact science to making art, and I don't want to pretend that there necessarily is. Now, yada, yada. In the Mixing Breakthroughs course, I do give some recommendations about exact target levels to shoot for, good starting places for here's where you might set the threshold of your bus compressor and where you might bring up the levels of your initial tracks to. And I go through a couple of different, exact levels, but those are really starting points. They're not finishing points. They're guidelines, and you can kind of almost pick anything within reason. Maybe one of these days I'll go into a whole episode where we just talk about loudness levels and LUFS, and we'll look at things on meters, and that should really be maybe a non-podcast episode where we really hear and look at loudness meters together. I think that goes beyond just talking about this stuff. So if there's demand for that, we can do something like that later on. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. But for now, I hope that answers that very simple question of Should I compress my buses? Should I limit them? Should I EQ them? Should I use crazy effects on them or leave them for the mastering engineer? And got to tell you, do whatever it takes to make great stuff. And you, as if you're a mixing engineer, if you're mixing stuff, you tell the person who's recording or producing it, don't leave stuff off for me to do. Make the recording, the initial production sound as great as you can. And if that means turning the knob around backwards to do it, then do it. Every step of the way, your record should sound like a finished record, right? From when you're initially recording it and producing it and getting the sounds, each element you add should sound like whatever it takes to get it to sound like the finished record of your dreams. And then approach the mix the same way. And I'm going to approach the master the same way when I'm mastering. Now, that said, I understand that you can be cautious about using this stuff in the beginning. And yes, the less you think you can understand and hear the sound of compression and limiting, the less of it you should use until you're really confident in your ability to hear it. But the only way to really learn how to hear it is to mess around with it and mess around with it often. So if you're too uncomfortable to use mix bus processing on your mixes, a little bit of compression, a little bit of EQ, a little bit of limiting, play around with your own foam masters. Go hog wild, go crazy, do too much of it. Experiment. Hear what these things sound like with a slow attack, with a fast attack, with a slow release, with a fast release. Hear what it sounds like if you do big cuts in the low mids and big boosts in the high end, on your mix bus, and hear what that does to a mix. Try this stuff, mess around with it, even if it's not going to be final. But I want you to just be confident and just go and just try things and just follow your ear. Listen to other records that you love the sound of. Let that be your basis of comparison to a significant degree. And the knowledge and the sophistication to know with time when not to mess around with things, when to barely use any compression, and when to use a ton, it just comes from practice and experience. And if you're too afraid to practice at it, you're never going to learn to hear it, and you're never going to get better. So here's your license to learn how to compress by sometimes over-compressing and then backing off on it a little bit and sending that to your mastering engineer. Well, I hope this episode has been useful for you. Another big shout out to this week's sponsors, Soundtoys. Soundtoys has been with this podcast since the very beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. If you want to go deeper with me and you don't want the full Mixing Breakthroughs course or Mastering Demystified course, I got some free stuff for you. Free workshop, The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers. I really think if you listen to that one, get through that, you're going to have some tremendous insights, maybe 5 tremendous insights that are really going to help you out a lot in mixing and music production, but at least 1, but probably 5. And also Mastering 101. You can try that out if you want to learn more about the mastering process. And if you want me to go into a lot more nerdy detail about mastering, you can get the whole Mastering Demystified course, but at least Mastering 101 will go a little bit more concrete, a little bit deeper into some of the general ideas that we're just scratching the surface on today. So check that out at SonicScoop.com/Mastering101. In the meantime, this has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time. Hey, are you still there? Did you like and subscribe? If not, please do so now. It will be better for both of us if you do. I promise. You're going to love the stuff you get. And if you go to SonicScoop.com, you can sign up for the newsletter there at the top of the page. You'll get once a week a recap of all of the best posts, videos, articles, podcast episodes, all that good stuff that we put out. So definitely check it out, SonicScoop.com. Hope to see you there.